Hello again. In this blog, I like to give all of you a brief overview of the causes of Alzheimer's and dementia. This is an important conversation because for the general public, Alzheimer's is just considered to be this general problem. But the fact that certain people are beginning to break Alzheimer's down into different component parts are very important in terms of possible research and also in terms of possible approaches to treatment. And I want to give Dr. Dale Bredesen credit for defining some of these areas that I'm going to discuss that pretty much correlate with my research as well over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of different causes. So it's powerful in terms of being able to approach and have hope in the treatment of this disease to know that there's actually some components of treatment that we can look at and the ways that we can break it down. So in terms of talking about 5 different vectors or elements that are causative agents in Alzheimer's, they include the following. And I'll name each one of them briefly and then go into detail, come back and go into detail with all of them. First one is inflammation. The second is atoxic or glycotoxic. The third is toxic. The fourth is vasculature or vascular. And the fifth is trauma. So let me go back and define each more a little bit about each one. Now, inflammation is one that I talk a lot about in my book, Preventing Alzheimer's in Just 10 Minutes a Day, because it's felt that inflammation in the body over time can finally overwhelm the brain and cause inflammation in the brain as well. And inflammation can have several different vectors. Certainly in terms of prior blogs and the ones we're going to talk about in the future, that at least 40 to 50% of the time in terms of food and toxins created by foods and reactions in the immune system, that inflammation can be a key culprit in causing problems in the brain. So inflammation from that factor alone and the involvement of the immune system can be at least probably half of the puzzle, half of the piece. But as well, there can be some sub-aspects. One is atoxic or glycotoxic, meaning there can be hormonal imbalance in the body. And in prior blogs, we just talked about the gut and how the gut actually creates neurotransmitters, which are affected by the brain. It can also create a majority of the serotonin that the brain reads. And that in terms of hormonal influences, which are gut connected and manufactured, that can create problems in the brain that are reflected in what are called atoxic or hormonal imbalances in the brain for a variety of reasons. Thirdly, when we talk about atoxic, the way that Dr. Bredesen talks about it primarily is in terms of heavy metals, which is, of course, a key area of conjecture and commentary in the autism community. So we can have, in terms of autism, an imbalance of mercury and mercury preservatives in pharmaceuticals, which is a whole nother can of worms to talk about. And in terms of Alzheimer's, influences of aluminum. And I talk in my book, I used to joke about when I was young, I would eat these Swanson TV dinners, and they're filled with, metal plates and metal coverings of tinfoil. And I used to think, even at 10 years old, gee, I wonder if somehow intuitively, my inner wisdom just knew, I wondered if intuitively all that aluminum maybe creep into the food, maybe that gets in the nervous system, maybe that has some influence on senility, well, which later on we started to call Alzheimer's. And of course, so there's a toxic component of heavy metals that may actually get transmitted across the blood-brain barrier. So that's another factor. Vascular is another one, where there's vascular insufficiency, as we just spoke about in a prior blog, where there's lack of vascular flow in the body and in the brain. That can result in less oxygenation being available in the brain. That's not a good thing. So there's a vascular component. And we talked about diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and the resultant effect on the brain as well. That can be a factor, a big factor in terms of people that have vascular events. And we spoke about how there's risk factors in terms of dietary issues and inflammation in the body that can lead to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, which is even more of a greater risk factor in Alzheimer's dementia. So there's that component. And finally, trauma, as in concussions, as in NFL players, as in soccer, as in closed head injuries, as in car accidents, trauma of any type, blows to the body, blows to the head. So trauma can be a factor. So when we look at all these factors, kind of like talking about Alzheimer's like autism like a puzzle, not one size fits all. It could be, for example, that 50% of someone's particular Alzheimer's dementia is caused by a vascular event, some cardiac event, some lack of oxygenation. It could be that half of the puzzle is caused by inflammation. It could be that 20% of the puzzle is toxicity or some type of heavy metals, or it could be some hormonal imbalance. So you never know until you actually analyze someone and evaluate, which we do very carefully on an individual basis with craniosacral therapy, how much of one factor is contributing to this disease process. It could be 5% inflammation. It could be 95% trauma, or any combination thereof. So you need to look and ferret out and break about very specifically what these disease factors are. Now, fortunately, craniosacral therapy can address a variety of these conditions, but knowing which one is most prevalent and which contributes is very powerful. That's why, with all credit to functional medicine, if you can actually do very strict medical tests, look at the blood titers, and look at which factors actually affect the blood chemistry, that can be an important adjunct in looking at which factors are most contributive to this disease process. So it gives us a lot more power to be able to do that. So in our ongoing research, what is allowing us to break things apart over time is we could look at a whole subgroup and say, hey, how many of these people have mostly inflammatory aspects? How many vascular? How many heavy metals? And actually design specific research in those subcategories, which would give us a lot of power. And in terms of doing that, in terms of research or treatment, it would be interesting to see if some of these subcategories recover more quickly with craniosacral therapy and other approaches. So it's powerful to even know that we could start to break things apart and view that as a clinical approach and a research approach to bring more power to what we're doing. So we'll talk a lot more about that, but just wanted to give you an overall view of some of the primary causes that we're looking at to start to break this problem into component parts, and therefore when we do that, being able to get more power clinically and research-wise in approaching this very complex area. So thanks for listening to this. We'll talk more about these areas as we progress through the blogs. And again, thanks for listening.